Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this case study number 3, where we are looking at the harmonization and facilitation of the movement of goods and services across borders during COVID. We have 2 eminent speakers, Sergio Fernandez from Mozambique. Welcome to Sergio. He's the president of the Federation of Clearing and Forwarding Associations of Southern Africa. Welcome to Sergio. We also would like to welcome Lovemore Bingandadi. He's sitting at SUDI, and he wears 2 hats. He's the program coordinator for the Tripartite Transport and Trade Facilitation Program, and very importantly, also the coordinator for the SADC Regional Trade and Transport Cell, which is the focal point for the coordination of guidelines and also standard operating procedures during COVID. Desidrio, it's my pleasure to invite you to make your comments to open the session, and then we'll go to Lovemore. Let's just mute our microphones when we're not.
Okay, once again, good morning to all the participants, and thank you, Trudy, for inviting me, or us, I should say, as representing the Federation. First and for all, presumable, all of you should in general know that in order for you to move your cargo from point A to point B, you always need some form of intermediate and transportation. And one of the main core roles of a freight forwarder is basically to ease and facilitate that with minimum challenges, headaches, and with the quickest possible time and most efficient way. So that being said and done, that basically, in a very simplified manner, explains our role as freight forwarders. A quick recap, well, basically, as a resume, I've basically been in freight forwarding for the past plus or minus 25 years. And it's a very interesting and challenging work every day, because you always have new challenges going in. And with the upcoming of COVID, which nobody expected and nobody had ever seen this pandemic level globally, we did see that a lot of things, what was discussed at policy level is not what was being implemented there on the ground. And that is where we, as regional freight forwarders, we tried to make sure that we contributed and aligned things together with the policymakers, with the other regional bodies, and discussed also on local government levels to make sure that whatever policies are implemented and introduced, they're in line with the reality and the practicality on the ground. For the case of citing, for example, the lockdowns or the constringent measures being taken, border controls, testing of the drivers, type of testing, the frequency of the testing, the movement of the cargoes, what cargoes are essential and non-essential, how essential is it? Because I know primarily most of the countries, they discuss essential goods as only being food products. But then if you have to look at the country as a whole, you also have the economical based products, which is what supports and sustains any economic in any country. Because it's no use you having the food if you don't have the money to buy the product. And in order for you to have the money to buy the product, you also need to sustain your other related industries. So that is where we as freight forwarders played a big role in discussing with the regional countries, with the national countries and national levels, to make sure that whatever policies which had been introduced and set as guidelines from SADC, that the respective countries who had agreed and abided to that, who agreed and signed to that, abided to that. Because we had cases like in some countries where when the drivers came in, they were quarantining the drivers for 14 days at an entry point. That is completely counterproductive in 3 senses. 1, it caused a strain to the health sector. 2, you had an impact to the movement of the cargo, which had a serious high delay on that. And 3, you have an increase in the cost of doing business because logically the transporter would have to be compensated some way on his truck standing idle. So one of our core roles as freight forwarders was always to make sure that we discuss with all parties involved to reduce that standby time, and also align policies between neighboring countries to make sure that you have a similar policies in both countries you have recognized policies and guidelines which are implemented by one, recognized by others. And as a freight forwarder, most of the time we tend to be the blunt, or could you say, the poor link in the chain, because whatever goes wrong anyway, as freight forwarders, we deal with the authorities, we deal with the customers, we deal with the transporters, and with the other multiple entities. So most of the time, anything which goes wrong, everything comes back straight to us. We then have to explain, justify, even if it's not something which is under our control. And that is one of the main reasons why we always have to make sure we are proactive in our dealings with the multiple parties, multiple entities, be it the private, be it the public, be it the supplier, be it the client, be it the authorities, to make sure that everybody is aligned to whatever policies or guidelines which are set. And the guidelines and policies which are set should be based on practicality and reality, be it in the safety factor or be it in the real work in terms of getting deliverables done. As a quick recap, just going back to what FICFASA represents. FICFASA represents the 14 SADC countries. We have sitting in FICFASA national representatives of all the freight forwarders association in each of those 14 respective countries. So when we discuss at FICFASA level, we always align with the national associations, and the national associations, when they're dealing with their respective governments, they speak with one voice on whatever we have discussed and agreed at regional level. So we always take into consideration the local scenario, the local policies, the guidelines, and what impact that has to the neighboring countries or to the corridors, be it in terms of tariffs and non-tariff issues. We always try to make sure we are there to be proactive, to intervene, and to mitigate, and to deliver the service in the most efficient and effective manner, in complying also with the policies and guidelines required by all the entities and authorities. That basically wraps up my quick short presentation. I hope I've not overlapped my time, and I pass over the ball to Lavmo.
Thank you so much, Desiderio. It's a good point on which to hand over to Lavmo. The alignment of policies at regional level, which you've highlighted, is absolutely essential. Otherwise, the transaction costs and, of course, the efficiency compromise is borne not only by the freight forwarders, but all along the supply chain. Lavmo, over to you. Thank you so much.
Your mic is muted, Lavmo.
Lavmo, I think we can't hear you if you just unmute.
Okay, thank you very much, Trudy, and thanks, Desiderio, for that picture of the challenges to trade and transport facilitation during this period of COVID. Just to remind ourselves, the role of SADC is to facilitate and coordinate the actions of member states in the area of transport. We are primarily focused on ensuring that we have got good road transport and rail infrastructure, and we've got commensurate trade and transport policies that facilitate the movement of goods and services at least cost efficiently across member states. COVID-19 has posed unprecedented challenges to our trade and transport facilitation environment in the region. Member states, in response to COVID-19, individually put in place emergency policies, measures, and regulations to allow for the movement of limited or goods classified as essential whilst fighting the pandemic. Because these initial responses by member states were not coordinated, it resulted in serious challenges and queues because of the additional public health measures which were introduced in an uncoordinated fashion. SADC, in response, then proceeded to develop and propose harmonized guidelines for the movement of goods across member states. These guidelines were initially developed and adopted by SADC during April, May. We then reviewed these guidelines recently in June. As the story has indicated, the initial phase of the response was mostly through lockdown measures, where cross-border movement of persons was suspended and only essential goods were allowed to move. But as the lockdown period and phase proceeded, some member states began now to loosen up and open up their economies so that we can go back to economic stability and reopen industries and other sectors of the economy that have been closed. To match that development, Secretariat then developed revised SADC guidelines and standard operating procedures, which were taking into consideration the changed situation in the region. These revised regulations were adopted on June the 23rd, and they are under implementation. The key to these guidelines is member states agreeing on COVID-19 testing protocols and procedures, where member states have agreed to mutually recognize COVID-19 negative certificates from drivers before they commence their trips. Such COVID-19 test results will be considered to be valid for 14 days, and drivers will have to adhere to specified routes. To facilitate the implementation of these measures, Secretariat has developed the corridor trip monitoring system, which is an electronic IT-based system where drivers and operators upload negative COVID-19 certificates, and then law enforcement agencies at border posts and wayside are able to read the information and verify that the driver has got a COVID negative certificate and allow and facilitate their movement. The guidelines have got other detailed requirements that drivers have to adhere to, so that if and when required, public health officials will be able to perform contact tracing. And these guidelines and measures are being implemented in the member states. However, we still face a few challenges because, first of all, member states are faced with different COVID-19 epidemiological challenges. We've got countries that are yet to reach their peaks and they are seriously affected, so they are also reverting back to lockdown positions while other countries are opening their economies. So coordinating cross-border movement in such an environment continues to be a challenge. Of recent, we have seen a series of borders temporarily being closed because of COVID-19 cases occurring at the borders. We also have the continued problem where member states have not fully implemented other measures such as pre-clearance, such as the single window and other facilitatory measures which would assist to reduce the times and delay that drivers and operators require to perform cross-border operations. But however, we are confident that if all member states implement the guidelines and adopt the corridor trip monitoring system, we will certainly improve and address the challenges that my colleague Desiderio has clearly outlined. I think with this background and update on what SADC has done, we can proceed by way of question and answer in order to further elaborate on some key points. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Lovemore and Desiderio, for those very important opening remarks. We already have two important questions. I see the list growing here, but let's start with two from Ben Laker. The first one, will 2020 change African agribusiness for good? Does it highlight the work ahead for the AFCFTA Secretariat and its collaboration with existing regional trade and trade facilitation bodies? Second question, also from Ben, how are the guidelines communicated to businesses operating across borders, and how are they adapting to the guidelines? And if I may add a question from Elisha Schumer. Welcome, Elisha. Question to Lovemore, seeing that COVID-19 may be with us for some time, is it possible to develop these guidelines into rules that are enforceable? Let's start with the first two questions. Question from Ben about changing agribusiness for good and the role of the AFCFTA. Desiderio, if I may come to you, and then Lovemore. To you.
Okay, Trudy, thanks. Basically, not only for the agribusiness has COVID changed. COVID has basically caused a global effect on all types of business. And with the Africa Free Trade Area signed, as freight forwarders, one of our members is actually gone, and we are actually going ahead to try and create a one Africa body. At the moment, we have a couple of regional bodies, which is SADC, EAC, and West Africa. But there are a lot of countries which do not have regional freight forwarder bodies. And in some cases, for the places which have regional bodies, our policies tend to be more or less aligned, because we tend to cost share, and in some cases we actually have members who are cross members between 2 or 3 different bodies. So the policies tend to be more or less aligned, right? And we always try to make sure that whatever we implement or whatever we discuss and recommend, it falls within the umbrella of all sectors, and it is practical. Our first idea whenever we're implementing or suggesting or recommending or discussing with the counterparts on policies and procedures is always the practicality of it. Because it's no use you putting a policy in place if there's no practicality to it, if it's not possible, or if it's not sustainable. So as logistics and freight forwarders, we always tend to think in 3 basic lines. Is it viable? Is it practical? Is it implementable? And on those bases, that's how we then tend to sit and discuss with our counterparts and also propose recommendation and changes. So yes, the work which is going to be done, it is going to affect everybody. And at the end of the day, we hope to have one common result and good achievable objectives. Thank you. Lovemore, to you.
Lovemore, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. With respect to the question about how the guidelines are communicated to the business community, first of all, in the development of the guidelines, the business community was consulted, specifically the Southern Business Council and the NEPAD Business Foundation are members of a regional trade and transportation cell, which was established by SADC ministers to develop and implement and monitor the guidelines. We also disseminate the guidelines by communicating them to regional associations such as the CFASA, Desiderio will confirm here, the SATA, and also our East African counterparts, FIAFA, and the East African and COMESA business councils. So we are always interacting, communicating, and sharing information about the implementation of the guidelines. The same way, the revision of the guidelines was based on feedback and input from operators as they faced challenges in the implementation of the first generation of guidelines. Elisha is asking the question, should these guidelines now be developed into rules that can be enforced? Definitely, yes. I saw something on a WhatsApp group yesterday that COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses in our systems. Certainly, this is certainly true in trade and transport facilitation. We need to revise all our policies, laws, regulations, rules, and procedures because we are never going back to the pre-COVID days. We need to move to a paperless trade and transport facilitation environment. We need to place more reliance on IT-based systems and procedures, which reduce human contact, but which are also more efficient than the paper-based systems that we had before. So I foresee a move by member states and the regional economic communities to start writing into laws, regulations, and procedures that are enforceable, new COVID-19 guidelines and standard operating procedures that we have adopted.
Thank you very much, Lovemore. That's a good point to end on, a digital trade solution looking forward. And I think this would certainly expedite matters, but also increase the efficiency across the supply chains. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we've come to the end. We are a couple of minutes over our time. Remains for us to thank our two presenters for the excellent discussion we've had here, and we look forward to see you in the final case study and then a networking. Thank you so much, Wendy. We're ready to leave.
Yep.
Okay.
And we move on to our final case study. A very big thank you to our two great speakers. I wish we had double the time to discuss the issues here. We'll see you in case study 4, the final case study before our networking, which is looking at marketplace platforms, two wonderful experienced speakers who are doing the job on the platforms. See you there.
Thank you so much.